All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thanks so much for coming to our Winter Faculty Research Fellows Chautauqua. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Mariam Hamadani, the Associate Director of CCSRE, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event. Now, before I turn it over to our moderator for today, who is Paula Moya, Professor of English, and by courtesy of Iberian and Latin American cultures, Paula is also one of our 2015 and 2016 CCSRE Faculty Research Fellows. I'll tell you a little bit more about her event coming up in March in a minute. So just a quick note about our Chautauquas. So we are here today to celebrate the work of Aaliyah Saperstein, our Faculty Research Fellow, that our event is organized around today, and also to enjoy just stimulating conversation around her new book manuscript, and some food and some wine among friends and colleagues. So I just want to point out, for those of you that have might not been to one of these before, that the Chautauquas are meant to be interactive, informal, and discussion-based, so please say hi to your neighbors. Feel free to get up and get more food and get more wine during the event, and please feel free to jump in and share your reactions and your ideas during the discussion part of the event. So next, I would also like to thank our co-sponsor for the event, which is the Institute for Research in the Social Sciences. So we thank IRIS for their support and for helping us spread the word. And finally, as I mentioned, I'd like to encourage you to come on March 10th to our Spring Faculty Research Fellows Chautauqua, featuring Paula Moya. And Professor Moya will be in conversation with Leah Gordon. We had her new book event in the fall about Paula's new book, The Social Imperative, Race, Close Reading, and Contemporary Literary Criticism. So we'll be back in this room March 10th, 4 p.m. The event is co-sponsored by the program in Feminist, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and make sure to RSVP so you get a copy of the book. So please see our flyers on the table for details, and then we also have our flyers for our winter Rick Faculty Seminar Series as well, so we hope to see you there too. So now let me turn it over to Professor Moya, who will introduce our speaker.
It gives me real pleasure to be here today to introduce Aaliyah Saperstein and just say a few things about her work before we get to hear from her herself. So Aaliyah is Saperstein, got her BA from the University of Washington, and she got her MA and her PhD from UC Berkeley. Now, after 3 years as an assistant professor of the University of Oregon, Aaliyah joined the faculty at Stanford University as an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology, where she is also affiliated with CCSRE, the Stanford Center for Population Control, and the program in Feminist, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Now, Aaliyah has published several award-winning papers and has been a visiting scholar at the Russell Sage Foundation. And this year, in addition to being a faculty fellow at CCSRE, she is also a faculty fellow at the Institute for the Research in the Social Sciences. Now, I have been a big fan of Aaliyah's, which she may or may not know, but it is true, ever since I heard her present in 2013 in connection with her faculty fellowship at the Clayman Institute. I think we were both faculty fellows there that year.
We're just following each other.
Yes. And since then, I've sought out and have read several of her published articles, some of which with her collaborator here, Andrew Penner. So it is really such a pleasure to be asked to moderate her Chautauqua today and to have the opportunity to read and discuss her single-authored book in progress, Racial Mobility, How Selective Fluidity Reinforces Social Inequality. Now, what I find so powerful about her work, and of course I want to just, most of you may know this, but I am a professor of English. I'm a literature professor, I'm a humanist. So I find much about her work that is powerful, but certainly I am speaking from my own social location as a humanist. And what I found so powerful is that she provides empirical, statistical evidence for something that I understood and have been writing about for years, namely that race is not something that can be adequately understood as separable and apart from gender and socioeconomic status, and of course, sexuality and ability. So this is your next challenge. Throughout my career, I have analyzed and written about the fiction, poetry, and essays of women of color, so self-described women of color. Now, these women have written powerful accounts of what it means for their experiences and their life chances that they are not only of color, not only female, not only poor, not only lesbian, not only disabled, but that they are often all these things at the same time, and that their life chances are shaped in the mutual constitution of these causally important aspects of identity. Now, in doing my own work on race and gender, I have often turned to work by sociologists and psychologists and historians and political scientists to help me understand the context within which these women were writing. But I always understood and accepted that social science methods would be reductive. Now, and I don't mean this in a denigrating way. I mean simply that I understood that in order to show that a particular aspect of identity, say such as race, was causally important, they needed to reduce down and hold other aspects of identity stable in order to prove the causal significance of the one under investigation. Now, I found as a humanist this a bit frustrating, but I accepted it as a methodological limitation of social science investigations. And it is not as if I could not see the limitations of my own methods. Okay, so I'm not pretending that we had it. We were all doing it so great, and they weren't. When you do a good close reading of a literary text, you can say many smart things about the text under consideration, but it is very hard to escape the charge that what you have found might be anomalous, or at least not generalizable to a larger group. After all, as I have been reminded by more than one of my social science colleagues, we literary critics don't have any data. So when I came across Aaliyah's work, I was quite simply blown out of the water. Using a large-scale national database collected over almost 20 years, so the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, and supplementing it with linked census data, as well as the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent to Adult Health, she has been tracking the way race, class, and gender work together to enable and constrain people's experiences and life chances. Now, to my knowledge, until Aaliyah and her collaborators came along, sociology had not had a good way of tracking racial dynamism. That is, of demonstrating empirically and statistically how a person's race is not only socially constructed, but also fluid and dependent on context and perception. I have read enough of Aaliyah's work now to see that this is really a game changer. Now, when I was born in Albuquerque, New Mexico in 1962, my birth certificate listed my race and that of my parents as white. When I gave birth to my first daughter in Houston, Texas, some 20 years later, her birth certificate listed her race and mine and her father's as Mexican American. Now, what happened in between? Was I abducted by aliens, right? And subjected to some sort of radiation treatment that changed the structure of my DNA? Well, of course not. What changed was my context, and with it, the local assumptions about what race people like me belonged to. Now, I wasn't included in the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, but if I had been, I may well have gone from www, or white, to other. And then when I received my PhD and was hired by Stanford, I might, if I really didn't make such a big deal out of being a woman of color, which I've done ever since I got here, I might have gone back to W, right? over the course of my life, I have been taken for anything from Mexican American to Italian to Haole, when in Hawaii, to Persian, although never Iranian, because those identifications were usually made by people who were themselves Persian in the U.S., right? They would never say, "Are you Arabian?" They say, "Are you Persian?" All that has changed in all of this has been my age, my clothing, my context, and the person who was making the identification, and the assumptions that person was making about my social status. In developing tools and methods to track racial mobility, and or how people change racial categories over time, or how they are perceived to have changed racial categories over time, and in articulating a racial mobility perspective, Aaliyah lends weight, breadth, and depth to the claim that race is not what we are. It is not even what we see. It is rather how we see. We don't look out and perceive each other objectively. Rather, we often see what we expect to see, in part because we have been socialized to look for particular cues and focus on some pieces of information rather than others. We do, of course, draw on real differences in physical appearance, but as perceivers, we humans are remarkably creative and stuck in our own ideas, right? So we extrapolate, we misremember, and we erase what is there in favor of what we think should be there based on what race or social status we imagine someone to be, and about the meanings that we associate with that race or social status. Now, our racialized perception has the effect not only, and this was an interesting aspect of the piece of the section of her book that she gave us today, it has the effect not only of fixing some people in place as members of a particular race. Okay, so remember, race is not what we are, it's how we see, right? So some people get stuck in place as members of a particular race, but also, and this is an interesting element of her discussion, of fixing races in place as markers of a particular status. So get a degree, get a job, move into a better neighborhood, the likelihood that you will be perceived as white increases. Get arrested, lose a job, get pregnant as a teenager, or get divorced, or even if your ancestry is predominantly European, as the famous welfare queen, I think probably was, right? You are that much more likely to be perceived as black. With the result that whiteness continues to be equated with success, and while non-whiteness continues to be associated with failure and criminality. It is, as Aaliyah notes, a self-fulfilling prophecy. Be perceived as black, and it is that much more likely, you will that much more likely to be arrested, jailed, or deemed, in Jennifer Eberhardt's memorable phrase, to be death-worthy, right, if you're perceived as black. Be perceived as white, and you are more likely to find yourself the beneficiary of some of the societal rewards usually reserved for some of the more privileged members of our society. So I'm going to end now to make room for Aaliyah to talk about her own work, but I thought I would, maybe I'll save my questions for afterwards. I have just a few questions that would come out of the, would you prefer that I save it afterwards? Or? Okay, excellent. So with that, please welcome Aaliyah Saperstein.
Thank you very much, Paula. I in some ways wish that this was a chance for you to do a close reading for me. That would be very instructive, I think. But that was a wonderful introduction and very humbling. In many ways, I'm like, okay, let's just go straight to the discussion. She pretty much covered it right there. You've got the paper, we're good. But I will take some time to kind of bring some of you up to speed. Maybe if I can be of help in walking some of you through some of the data, I'm happy to do that. I'm a sociologist, but I'm also trained as a demographer, which means I go to a lot of talks with economists and other people who like to jump in while you're talking and not wait till you're done talking before they have their questions. So if we can hold substantive questions till the end, that'd be great. But if, as I'm showing a chart or some aspect of the data, you have a clarifying question, please don't be shy about raising your hand and asking the question so I can kind of clarify right away. So I should start, Paula actually covered a number of these for me, which was very, very helpful. But this is a project I've been working on for more than 8 years. And so I have grown indebted to a number of people and foundations over the course of these last 8 years as I've tried to sort of, this is, currently the research exists as these kind of separate articles, and I'm trying to bring them together and synthesize them into the book. And so a number of I've gotten support from a number of places, but I also do want to acknowledge that most of the work is co-authored. So most of the articles are co-authored, even though I'm the one who's got the daunting task of trying to figure out how to synthesize them all into an argument. And as Paula said, one of my most favorite co-authors, Andrew Benner, is here. But I do want to acknowledge Erin Gullickson, who actually, ironically, the first 3, we were all in grad school together at Berkeley. So there's something very generative, I guess, about being a grad student at Berkeley and being locked away in a small office. We all share all of our Andrew and I all had desks next to each other in graduate school, and we ended up being co-authors, so that's kind of cool. But this is as much their work as mine. It's sort of my attempt to try to synthesize everything that we're saying. So what is a racial mobility perspective? What I'm hoping to do in the book, or what I hope the book accomplishes, is to unite a social constructivist approach to race, with heavy emphasis on social psychology, with the conceptual and empirical tools that sociologists tend to use to study social mobility. So this may not sound that strange to people in this room. I usually find myself talking to demographers and quantitative social scientists to whom this sounds really strange. And I often have to do a lot of work to motivate why we want to bridge this gap and what it's going to accomplish. And I had a really hard time preparing my slides for today because I'm like, wait, they're not going to think this is weird. Like, I don't even know how to talk about it and frame it if the audience doesn't think this is weird. So bear with me if some of this is like, yeah, we know that, keep going. You can just give me that signal if you want. But the goal, and kind of, as someone who was trained in sociology and in demography, I found myself having these very odd conversations with, Michael Omi on the one hand, and then someone who wants to calculate the death rate for blacks and whites and compare it over time using death certificates on the other. And they quite literally were not talking to each other, but it was also just difficult to reconcile, well, what do I do with this information that race is socially constructed when I have this data that is not sort of letting it be socially constructed, or is not acknowledging that the ways in which race is socially constructed. So I'm hopeful that by kind of bringing these approaches together and bridging these conversations, I can not only help us advance research on race and racial categorization, but then also help everyone, hopefully, better understand the processes that maintain racial inequality. So I'm going to paint a very broad and unflattering picture of research in sociology. It is sort of ideal typical. I do think it's not, it is not only my colleagues that are doing this, certainly. Political science, research in political science tends to have this challenge as well. I think a lot of the social sciences, in many ways we can say that we have embraced the idea of race as a social construction, but we have, many of us, and I don't think the humanist side probably suffers from this problem, but I do think many of the social scientists suffer from a kind of like, yes, we're on board with race as a social construction, but we only think of it in the comparative historical sense. And by that I mean, oh yeah, sure, the rise of the one-drop rule. That's an example of race as a social construction where we didn't used to think about race that way. Maybe we don't think about it now, but that was a very clear organizing rhetoric, organizing set of practices that shaped the way that race worked in a particular era in the United States. You can also think about the way that we, often when we say, well, race is a social construction, like you might be seen differently in California than Alabama or than the US and Brazil. Right? So we tell people to think of it as like it's different over time and it's different across countries in this kind of macro sense. I think we also, as sociologists, tend to talk about what some people have called boundary shifting. So we talk about the position of groups and how the position of groups has shifted. You can think of the Irish becoming white, Italians becoming white. Now are Asians and Latinos, are they becoming white? Somehow we never think about, is somebody becoming black? I'm not sure why we never formulate, nobody's ever going in any other direction, which is interesting. But we kind of think of it as this group level phenomenon where it's not about the individuals necessarily, it's about the positions of categories and hierarchies and who's being absorbed and who's being left out, right? But we're still up here at this kind of micro, in some ways abstract, discussion about the way that race works. The individual level corollary to that, which I think in many ways the humanists are much better at capturing, or for example our colleague Alison Hobbs captures very well in her work, social scientists tend to call the individual level version boundary crossing. So if in boundary shifting, the boundary shifts over you, right? Somebody redefines the category and what that means, and so the boundaries of the category shift over you. In boundary crossing, the boundaries between the categories stay the same, and you cross as an individual cross over them. So that's kind of, the classic example is of course passing. So the idea that you would pursue the more advantaged category, you would leap that boundary. But in social science, we treat that as a rare occurrence. So it's not that we don't think that it happens. Yes, we know passing happens, yay. But we don't actually model, we don't think that it's treated as the exception rather than the rule of the way that race works in the United States. And you can also think of this, I think in popular discussions, we also treat it that way. So the fact that Rachel Dolezal was seen as crazy is in many ways because we haven't reconciled the idea that race is a social construction in the macro level sense with the idea of race being a social construction and the extent to which it's socially constructed at this kind of very individual level. So there are heated debates in Brazil about whether money does actually whiten. So people say it does, but does it actually do that, or is this just kind of a myth or a way of talking about the way that the racial hierarchy works? So I think it's very telling that we've embraced some portions of racial construction and not others. And I think in some ways, it's a bit of a catch-22, why it is that we've embraced some aspects of this and not others. I think that it's partly because we haven't joined the theories about race as a social construction to our empirical methods. And so that's why that's kind of the step that I want to take. If we think this is happening, we actually need to change our methods and the way that we collect data about race, the way that we model it, etc. Now you could argue, if we had been collecting it all along, then maybe we wouldn't think that the individual level is so strange. So, it's difficult to tell which way the causality goes, as is often the case. But I do think that I guess my hope is that if we incorporate it into our methods, we will be forced to confront some of the tensions in the way that we think about race as socially constructed. And most of my research is quantitative, so I am generally talking about this in terms of quantitative measures of race. But I do think there are similar issues with some qualitative research. And there's a great paper by Edward Morris in Qualitative Sociology that kind of talks about how even qualitative work, ethnography, etc., does take some things for granted about the social construction of race. When you go to study race in school, how do you pick the school? You use census data to pick a diverse school or a not diverse school, right? How do you decide the kids that you're studying? Do you assign their race? Do you ask them? Do you ask what the parents think or the teachers think? Right, so I think there are many ways where this applies across disciplines, but I am going to focus most of my discussion on how this can be incorporated into quantitative research in particular. So what is it that quantitative studies do that irritates Paula and me and many other people? So what they're typically doing, what the sort of underlying assumption is behind most of quantitative studies that use race as an independent variable is that they treat it as what Talcott Parsons or Ralph Linton would call an ascribed characteristic. So that's not simply ascribed in the sense that somebody assigned it to you. They mean it ascribed in the sense that it is fixed and out of your control. This is something that you, from birth, you're stuck with whatever this is. That's an ascribed characteristic. Their classic examples would be sex. You can just put a pin in that one. Their classic examples would be sex, age, and something like caste. You could probably put a pin in that one too. But this is what they were thinking of when they were thinking of what an ascribed characteristic is. The key is that it's thought of as something out of your control. So because of this, race, for those of us who statistically estimate models of inequality, race appears in our models as this exogenous factor. So it comes from outside of the stratification system to shape people's opportunities and life chances. It's not considered something within the stratification system or that is shaped by the stratification system. So it's something separate that we kind of control for, and in order to look at the things we really care about, right? Which is it is a strange way of looking at things just in general. But so in this sense, race, the way that we typically use race, it's treated as analogous to our date of birth or the place where we were born. It's out of our control. The exact date, well, maybe now people can control the exact day that their kids were born. I'm having a C-section right now. But the kid didn't get to control it, is maybe the more important point. The kid didn't get to control the day that he or she was born or the place where the birth occurred. Those are factors that are, in a very classic sense, fixed and out of your control. They come from outside the stratification system to shape your life chances. Instead of thinking of race this way, I think, so that in sociology, the studies of stratification conceptually juxtapose, or I guess they're more like ideal types. On one end, you have ascribed characteristics that are fixed, out of your control, and assigned at birth. And on the other side, you have what are considered achieved characteristics, things that you do exert some control over, that you can kind of pursue over your life course. And what's interesting is that in sociology, the things that we consider to be achieved, we think mobility is perfectly normal on these characteristics. And in surveys in particular, we measure them regularly. So if we follow you over time, we're going to ask you over and over and over again, how much money do you make? Did you get a degree? What degree did you get now? Did you get a higher one? Are you married? Are you still married? Right? So these are, where do you live? Do you live in the same place where you lived 5 years ago? So we don't think of, for the things that we think of as achieved characteristics, we think it's perfectly normal to measure these multiple times to see if you've continued to achieve, or where you are in this kind of stratification system. But what's interesting, the ideal types, as all ideal types are, mask some complexity. We don't have characteristics that are only fixed and out of our control, and characteristics that are fully in our control that we can change, right? A lot of things that we care about in studies of inequality are some combination of the two, or fall somewhere on a spectrum between ascribed and achieved. So we can think of social class. We are all born into a social class. Whether or not we want to think about that as being somehow biologically inherited, like the horrible studies of IQ, right? Like, regardless of how you want to think about inheritance and what you have at birth, we have things like a social class at birth. We have citizenship at birth. We have a number of characteristics that we think of as an individual characteristics, and that we care about inequality, both because we care where you start, but we also care about where you start, how where you start shapes where you end up. Does it constrain, given that you were born into a particular social class, does that constrain where you end up, not only in terms of class, but in these other outcomes, right? So we do recognize that achieved characteristics often have an ascribed component to them, but we still allow them to change over time. And that's what I'm hoping I can convince not only you, but more importantly, perhaps, in some ways, the people who collect data, to think about race. That this is a fruitful way to think about race. That it's not something that is out of the individual's control in the classic sense of the time that they were born or the place where they were born. So, what's one way that we could do this? In sociology, very just simple descriptive tool to study where people are moving in the socioeconomic class structure is what's called the mobility table. This one happens to come from Sao Paulo, Brazil in 1956. It's just an example. There's nothing terribly important about it, but they all have the same structure. The rows are the person's origin. The columns are the person's destination. So they've ranked occupations: professional, managerial, intermediate, non-manual, lower non-manual, etc. And then they look, okay, point A is your origin, point B is your destination. Where did you go in terms of occupation? So the people on the diagonal stayed in the same place. They were in the same occupation at the end that they were at the start. Anybody off the diagonal experienced occupational mobility. They moved either up or down what is conceived of as an occupational hierarchy, and that creates the mobility table for the population. One thing of interest to note in this particular table, you see here there are some zeros. What that indicates is that people who started out in the highest occupational categories were unlikely to fall all the way to the bottom of the occupational hierarchy. So there's not perfect fluidity. People aren't just moving around randomly, right? There's structure to occupations and who moves from which one and how far you can move. So what if we thought about race that way? So what I'm going to show you, this is a table constructed very similarly. Instead of raw counts, I'm showing you percentages. So that's one thing to note. They are row percentages. This is data from the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health. This example happens to be limited to men, but the table actually doesn't look significantly different if we looked at women or both together. So again, you're looking at the same thing, the origin in the row and the destination in the column. In this case, we're just thinking about racial origins as the first time point that we observed you. We can talk about, I think, ways of conceiving racial origins and how we would want to think about racial origins, but for this purpose, it's just time 1 and time 2. Origin is time 1, destination is time 2. So given that you were assigned this, the other key point, this is race as assigned by the interviewer. This is not how the person self-identifies, this is how they were perceived in a face-to-face interaction. So people start out as white, Black, Native American, or Asian. And then when they're interviewed 6 or 7 years later, the interviewer assigns them their race again. Much like with occupation, you can see that there is mobility. In fact, unlike the table from Brazil, there are non-zero values in every cell. There is more stability with race along the diagonal than you saw in the example for occupational mobility. But again, so some directions, there's more stability. There is fluidity in very particular directions, is one thing you might notice. But there are non-zero values in every cell of this table. So why is thinking about race using a table like that helpful? I think the key thing that it does, that I'm hoping it kind of changes just ever so slightly the way that people think about race, is that it requires researchers to allow everyone to have a racial origin and a racial destination instead of assigning everyone a fixed race. So it encourages us, it also, much like studies of occupational mobility, which sometimes track parents and children. So what was your parents' occupation or your parents' class compared to yours? So that's an intergenerational study of mobility. You could also study mobility intragenerationally, my first job to my second job. We can do the same with race. We can think about how race changes intergenerationally from parents to children, and whether and how it changes intragenerationally across the individual's life course. I think the mobility table also helps us visualize that both stability and fluidity are patterns of interest. I think in some ways people get frustrated thinking about race as a social construction because it feels like it just creates chaos, right? It just unhinges race and it makes everything too complicated. We're not, like, everything is not fluid. That is not the point that I want you to walk away from. It is not that everything is fluid. It is that we're interested in both when and for whom race is fixed, and when and for whom race is fluid. And I would argue in what directions, but we'll get there in a second. I think perhaps the most important thing that the table does is it requires people to use data at 2 points in time. So again, you can't treat race as fixed if you've been required to measure it and display it and think about it at 2 different points in time. You're forced to grapple with why there are people off the diagonal, even if you think that race is fixed and they should be on the diagonal. So once we've seen that mobility, racial mobility, can happen, we can also start to think about, well, how do we want to explain it? Why is it that some people are on the diagonal and some aren't? Why do they move from one category or another? And I'll go through 2 explanations in a little bit of detail with some empirical examples, but I'll list sort of 3 popular ways of thinking about why we might expect to see mobility. One is what I would call structural mobility. And this is, again, analogous to studies of occupation. And you can think of it as changing categories, so that the structure of race itself changes, not that anything changes about the individuals. They're just being moved around in a different structure of race. The other possible explanation for why people experience racial mobility is because the classification scheme is bad. It doesn't actually capture the variation in the population. It's hard to put certain people in certain categories. The categories have weird names. Nobody really knows what's going on. So I call that categorical ambiguity, the idea that it's difficult to decide who should be in which category, or that some people should be in which category. A third reason that will be familiar to many of you, of course, is the idea that people are passing or giving racial performances. Unfortunately, the data is not well suited to address whether or not passing or performance is actually happening. It's kind of, the fact that there is mobility suggests that passing and performance are likely occurring, but I don't, and I would highly caution you to assume that the racial mobility is the result of intent either on the part of the person being interviewed, or potentially even regardless of the intent of the person doing the interviewing. They are probably not aware that they are assigning race in the way and in the particular patterns that they are. So I think it's very helpful to think about passing and performance and why some people might change race. But it's something that we'll have to talk about and speculate about, and hope that as more people come to see race this way, they will collect data about self-identity in ways that allow us to study that kind of process and its interaction a little bit better. So let's talk briefly about what I'm calling structural mobility. Now again, remember, the data that we're focusing on here is assigned by the interviewer. It's not identified by the respondent. That's part of why it's difficult to tell whether or not they are passing, right? In order to determine whether someone was passing, you might want to see both their identity and the interviewer's classification at the same time to see how they're interacting with each other. That data doesn't exist, at least not yet. But interestingly, we have surveys that do have these repeated measures that include how the interviewer perceived the respondent. And I'm happy to tell you more about the data and why we have that data and what they were thinking if we have time later. But so structural mobility, we can think about in classic studies of occupations, this is the change from farming to manufacturing, the decline of manufacturing and the rise of information technology. Those are structural changes in the occupations that people have in this country. And so that because the structure of occupations change, in some ways that's independent of the individuals who are moving. So because we no longer have as many farmers as we used to, that's going to constrain where people with farm origins can go because they can't stay on the farm. That's kind of the idea of structural mobility, that the change is an institutional one, a societal level one, that is happening to individuals. This can affect the number of categories, how the categories are named, and how they're ranked relative to each other. So what you're looking at then is another mobility table, again, origins in the rows, destinations in the columns. This is from the same survey, the Survey of Adolescent Health, but instead of between waves 3 of the survey and wave 4, you're now looking at the difference between wave 1 and wave 3. And what the survey did was between wave 1 and wave 3, it dropped the category other. So in wave 1, it let interviewers classify respondents as other. In wave 3, it was like, nah, you don't get that category anymore. So what happens? The 944 people that were classified as other in the first wave and who appear later again in the survey now have to be put in another category. That's what I mean by structural mobility. We don't know, nothing changed in their lives that forced them to move into these categories. The survey changed, and that forced them to move into these other categories. Notice, though, that there is mobility in the entire table. People are moving around in all of the categories, not just in the row where they took the category away. So I think it's helpful. Often survey researchers would think of this as a methodological artifact. Well, of course race changed. You changed the measure, right? I think it's fruitful to think of this, in a sense, reframe it as structural mobility. Your vision of race changed, and that changed how people were classified. I think it's worth asking, why did 76% of those people end up in white? How were their experiences different than the people who ended up in Black, American Indian, or Asian, right? So structural mobility, often it would be viewed as a mess. We aren't even going to use that data. We're going to exclude those people because we don't know what to do with that. But if we reframe it as structural mobility, it becomes an interesting question. How are their outcomes different than people in the other categories, than people who started as white and stayed white, who had the same origin and destination rather than changing? So the other potential explanation for racial mobility is categorical ambiguity, another popular one. So again, it's the idea that some people will be harder to fit in a given scheme than others. This is a general problem with classification schemes. It's not unique to race, of course. It is exacerbated by not having clear criteria or instructions for assigning racial categories. And in all of the data that I use, the interviewers are given no instructions. They are given categories and they are simply told to categorize the respondent. So they have no idea what white is supposed to mean, what black is supposed to mean. It just means whatever it means to them. So we might think about, we could brainstorm probably at characteristics that we think might be associated with people who were difficult to classify, who different interviewers at different points in time or the same interviewer at different points in time might decide, you know what, I thought you were white before, but no, you're not, you're now black, or you're now Asian, or you're now something else. So who might be likely to experience this categorical ambiguity? Well, we might think that it's people who identified as multiple races in the previous wave of the survey, people who reported a Hispanic origin, so from a country like Cuba or Puerto Rico or Mexico, people perhaps who are not born in the U.S. In this case, the measure is, are you not born a U.S. citizen? And then we also have data on how the interviewer perceived the respondents by skin tone in wave 3. The categories are black, dark brown, medium brown, light brown, and white. So what you can see is that the characteristics that we think make people difficult to classify do appear to make people difficult to classify. We're not crazy. Identifying as multiple races makes it much more likely. This is 16% versus 4%, 15 versus 2, 13 versus 4. down here in skin tone, the most likely people to experience a change in classification from wave 3 to wave 4 are people who the interviewer described in wave 3 as light brown. Which is just a fascinating, whatever. I didn't give them the categories. But what I want you to notice is that they're not the only people moving. There are not zeros on the other categories. It's much less likely, but it's still happening. So clearly categorical ambiguity is going on, even in the absence of structural mobility. So this is looking at 2 waves where the categories did not change. So we can't use structural mobility to explain the variation, and we can't use categorical ambiguity to explain all of the variation that we see in this table. So one thing, before you get excited about that too, we'll have to dig into it a little bit. I think one of the other challenges that we face as race scholars and as researchers is we tend to have battles, or we have historically had battles about whether race is fixed or is fluid. The drawback of a mobility table is it does keep us in that binary who moved, who didn't move. Right? If you only have 2 points in time, those are the only options. Who moved, who didn't move. So it's not surprising that we tend to focus on explanations like structural mobility or categorical ambiguity, because we really only have, that's the clearest criteria that we can use. If we had data at more than 2 points in time, we can start asking much more interesting questions and start unpacking the category of fluid. So this is data from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. Like the data from Ad Health, it is classified by the interviewers at the end of the survey. Unlike the study of Ad Health, this one we have up to 17 years of racial classification for the respondents in the survey. This is a survey of about 12,000 men and women, and about 20% of the sample experiences at least one change in their race over this time period. So suddenly, we have a much larger category of fluid than we might have expected. All of these people are now fluid. All of these different types of fluidity are open to analysis and exploration. So what you're looking at is different levels of fluidity that appear in the survey. So the most fluid people had 10. The easiest way to describe it is discrepant classifications. Not changes, but years in which their racial classification was different than their most common racial classification. You don't want to think about it as a change, because this is one change and one discrepancy. This is 2 changes, but 1 discrepancy. So we don't want to talk about changes in race when we have a trajectory, because that privileges where in the trajectory the change occurs. So if it seems, I'm not using discrepant as like a judgment. I'm trying to capture that difference between a change and a difference in the rest of the trajectory. And so these are the different levels of fluidity that you can find in the survey, and this is the most common example, not the only example, but the most common example of the racial trajectory at each level of fluidity. So to me, what I see in this table is that these changes beg explanation, not just who's stable and who's fluid, but why are people changing in the particular directions that they are, and when they are. Why does this person go from white to other? Why do some people bounce around? In a given year, why do you go from white to other and then back? Are these categorical ambiguity can't predict these. It predicts what gets you from 0 to 1 or more. It can't help us explain why a particular change occurs in a particular direction in a particular year. So that's where my wonderful friends in social psychology, but also in law and history, I think help us provide answers, or at least some expectations for why people might move from one category to another over time. And the key is that Americans don't actually use ancestry and phenotype alone to decide their racial classifications. We know this from not just social psychological experiments, but also from examples like Ariella Gross's study, What Blood Won't Tell. She looked at the transcripts from trials of racial determination in the 19th century. And she considered, so these were cases where your race needed to be decided in order to determine some other outcome. Could you testify against somebody else? Could you inherit, your husband's estate or something like that? So your race was a legal question, and the jury or the judge needed to decide what category you belonged in order to adjudicate the case. So that's what she's looking at. And one of the things that she finds that yes, of course, they probe people's physical appearance, sometimes literally. They ask about ancestry, but they also allow testimony about how the people live. Did they vote? What kind of job they had? Who were their friends? Where did they live? So they use these sort of markers of social status to help them make sense of ancestry and phenotype in cases where they're not really sure what's going on. We can also see it in the census enumerator instructions. In the past, census enumerators were explicitly told when they were to decide whether someone was Indian, for example, to use that person's status in the community. So, were you accepted in the community as Indian or white? That information was used to decide how you were recorded in the census. We also know from social psychology that our stereotypes, how we think about race categories, I guess is one way to think about it, is also about value judgments and perception and expected behavior. And I'm thinking here of Jennifer Richeson's and Sophie Trewalter's study, where she has pictures of admired whites and admired blacks and disliked whites and disliked blacks. You can think of JFK and Jeffrey Dahmer, O.J. Simpson and Martin Luther King. It's much easier for people, what they find is it's much easier for people, especially white people, apparently, but it's much easier for people to categorize admired people as white and disliked people as black than the opposite. It takes them longer, they make more mistakes. But all of the data, as Paula suggested, suggests that we don't see race objectively. Objectively in the sense of, I just look at your hair and your skin color and that's how I decide. We don't actually see, when we look at someone, we don't look at a particular characteristic. We don't listen to what they hear about their family tree. We take in the entire picture of what we know about them, where we see them, all of that sort of thing. So this allows us to then ask, well, what whitens people? You can think of it in a Brazilian money whitening sense, if you like. So you can take in the NLSY everyone who was seen as not white in a particular year, and then ask how many of them were classified as white in the next year. On average, that happens just less than 9% of the time. So what we want to know is what moves it from that average. If you think of the average as categorical ambiguity, measurement error, you can think of that average however you want. But on average, people move 9% of the time. What moves them? What makes it more or less likely than average that they're going to move? Unfortunately, our social psychologist colleagues are correct. What makes them move is social status. Did you get a change? And this is whether you experienced a change in your social status in the same year. So you were not white. This compares people who changed their marital status, who changed where they lived, did they move to the suburbs, who changed whether they completed college, and who changed whether they became an unmarried parent, either by giving birth to a child or by getting divorced and previously having a child. So in all of these cases, the good things, the things that we think of as leading to upward mobility, make you more likely to be seen as white by the interviewer. And the thing that we're not so sure about, unmarried parenthood, we like getting married and having children. We don't like people doing them out of order. And so that makes it less likely that you're going to be seen as white if you became an unmarried parent in the intervening year. The reverse is also true. What you should notice is that it's an order of magnitude less likely to become black, to go from not black to black in a given year. So here we're looking at 0 to 18%. Here we're looking at 0 to 1.8%. It's very rare for people to change from not black to black in the survey. But when they do, we see the complementary, not in a good way, pattern. When bad things happen to you, you are now more likely to be seen as black. You're more likely to be seen as black when you become an unmarried parent, you lose your job, become impoverished, or don't finish college between 1 year and the next. This is mostly for anybody here who does statistical modeling. Those are all descriptive results. They hold up to pretty much everything that we've been able to throw at them over the years. And we have replicated this across 3 separate data sets and time periods, and also across a categorization experiment in a psychology lab, which I'm happy to talk about at the end. So before I finish, I do want to show you one more example. We've been talking a lot about black and white. There isn't a lot of good data that tracks categories beyond black and white over long spans of time. Surveys haven't recognized that there are categories beyond black and white, sadly, for very long amounts of time. But Ad Health does give us at least 2 years where we can see people changing across other categories. So we can see, is this just about stereotypes about black and white, or does this seem to be about our racial stereotypes more broadly? So here we can look at, this is, so we have the categories of Asian, white, American Indian, and black. And this is predicting whether or not men, in particular, were seen as Asian, white, American Indian, or black after they experienced a first arrest. We look at incarceration here because the Ad Health cohort is at prime age for contact with the criminal justice system. They're not at prime age for having occupational mobility yet. So what you're looking at is the odds that someone was going to be, are the odds higher or lower that someone was going to be seen as in a given category, given that they experienced a first arrest in between the 2 surveys. So you're less likely to be seen as Asian or white if you report that you've been arrested, and you're more likely to be seen as American Indian or black. And these are odds ratios from models that control how you were seen in the previous year. So it's effectively asking, did you change to one of these other categories? So you might think of this as showing the hierarchy of our stereotypes of criminality, right? So Asians and whites are not, we don't associate Asians and whites with crime or experience with the criminal justice system. We do associate American Indians and blacks with crime and association and contact with the criminal justice system. That's one way to read this result. And we can see this even more clearly when we look at the specific racial trajectories that these people take. So imagine you started as Asian in wave 3, or you started as American Indian. These are the options for where you could end up. Where you end up mirrors that same racial trajectory. So if you started out as Asian and you were arrested, you're much less likely to stay Asian. In fact, you're more likely to be classified as white, which I kind of like. You're also more likely to be classified as American Indian. Not very many people switch back and forth between Asian and black in this survey. If you start out as American Indian, you're much more likely to stay American Indian. And this is actually a really interesting finding for survey researchers because the American Indian category is notoriously unstable. But what predicts stability is if you've been arrested in between the 2 waves. You're more likely to be seen as American Indian or black, and much less likely to be seen as white or Asian. So what this suggests to me is that both racial stability and racial fluidity are working together to maintain observed racial disparities. So it's not just the people who are moving that are helping maintain statistical associations, if you will, between blackness and crime or Asianness and the lack of crime. It's not just fluidity that's helping maintain that. It's the relationship between who stays the same and who moves. And this likely further strengthens the stereotypical associations that created these classifications in the first place. So the example in this chart is blackness and crime, or having reported being arrested. So people who were previously classified as non-black are much less likely to change to black if they were not arrested between the two survey groups. They were previously classified as non-black and they were arrested. It's not big, it's 3%, but they're more likely to change to be seen as black by the interviewer after they've reported an arrest. So we have stability as non-black and fluidity into the black category. If you were previously classified as black and you were not arrested, you're more likely to leave the black category. You're less likely to stay black, according to the interviewer. If you were previously seen as black and you were arrested, you are not going to be seen as anything other than black by the interviewer the next year. So again, we have a pattern of fluidity, drawing people away from the category, and a pattern of stability, keeping people in the category, and thus maintaining the association between blackness and crime. Previously, if you were not arrested, whether you were previously black or not, you are less likely to be in the black category the next wave. If you were arrested, whether you were previously black or not, you are more likely to appear in the black category in the next wave. So in conclusion, I hope that I've convinced you and everyone else that a racial mobility perspective can advance research on race and inequality. And in particular, I think, and I don't know if this strikes a sort of chord with you guys as well, but often I run into the argument that if we think about social construction, it just makes things complicated. I think here we have an example of where attending to social construction doesn't sidetrack us from what really matters. In some ways, it actually helps us see what's going on even more clearly. So focusing on racial trajectories and categorization processes and seeing race as socially constructed highlights the mechanisms that shape the relationship between race and inequality. And unfortunately, one of those mechanisms is that vicious cycle that I just showed you, in which patterns of racial mobility, who's moving, who's staying, when, in what direction, not only maintain aggregate inequality, but they also very likely reinforce our very ideas about racial difference and who belongs in which category. Thank you.